All right, welcome to Chapter 13. You're in your final week. You have your final exam. Your final exam will be very similar to the first two exams. However, there will be more questions on your final exam than there were on your first two exams. And it will have more value weighted to it as well. But it will be still the same familiar. It will have to be aware of what type of formulas and what formulas are used for. Not that you will have to take data and run the formula, but I want you to know what the formulas are used for. It'll have terms, concepts about how we make predictions and assumptions using economics. And so what are the end values in some of those assumptions and what we do with those assumptions, what firms do with those assumptions, and also what government agencies or entities do with those assumptions. So let's move on to Chapter 13, which addresses firms in competitive markets. We'll touch a little bit on Chapter 14 and monopolies. I don't know if we'll have enough time, but I do want to at least make you aware of some of the monopoly issues and markets that are sitting out there, since we deal with so many of those in our daily lives. But we will just touch on that a little bit. It will not be on your test, though. Okay, so in Chapter 12, we discussed and developed the cost curves in which firms use their behavior, or which firms base their behavior of whether or not to produce more, produce less, or to opt in or opt out of markets. These cost curves that we talked about in Chapter 12 are also employed in Chapter 13 that we'll go through too, because this will show how a competitive firm responds to the changes in the market and the market's conditions. The Monopoly Chapter 14 will also employ the same cost curves to see how monopolistic firms react in markets as changes happen in the markets as well. But first, let's talk about competitive markets and their factors. What are we looking for in a competitive market? What's the meaning of competition? It's not exactly the same as in sports, where there's a winner and a loser. Remember, we talked about in trade how sometimes trade can benefit both groups, not equally all the time, but can benefit both groups. So market competition has a little bit different meaning than, say, sports. So let's look at the book definition. The book definition of a competitive market is a market with many buyers and sellers trading identical products, so that each buyer and each seller is what we call a price taker. We've talked about price takers, global price takers, domestic price takers. So competitive market, each person in the competitive market is a price taker for whatever the price that they're selling. There's three main characteristics that we look for in a competitive market. We also referred to this in earlier chapters as a perfectly competitive market. But the three issues that we look for is that there are many buyers and many sellers, many producers and many consumers. Also, that the goods offered by the sellers are largely the same. So we're comparing hamburgers to hamburgers, hot dogs to hot dogs, Cokes to Cokes, or Cokes to Pepsis. Pretty much everything's the same, so that you can make assumptions and infer from this. And also that the firms can freely enter or exit the markets at the same time, or at either time. So first, let's look at the revenue of a competitive firm. What is the average revenue? The total revenue from the sale of the output is equal to the price takers in the quantity. So the book's definition of the average revenue is total revenue divided by the quantity sold. So then we look at marginal revenue. The definition for marginal revenue is the change in total revenue from an additional unit sold. So what is our change as we produce more? Are we making more money? Or because we're flooding the market with supply, are we making less money because we have overages and we've spent more money on employee costs to produce those more supply, but we're not selling them as a rapid pace? So we have to look at the difference in the two. So how do we and how do firms determine the profit maximization in a competitive firm's supply? Let's look at the example in your book. It talks about a farm that is producing gallons of milk. The profit maximization quantity can also be found by comparing marginal revenue and marginal cost. In this example, we're talking about marginal revenue as it exceeds marginal cost, increasing output, which will cause it to rise. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, then the firm can increase profit by decreasing output. If profit maximization occurs where marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, then the marginal cost of the firm's supply decision will be appropriate for the market. So we look at these cost curves to make sure they have special factors and input for our analysis. The marginal cost curve is upward sloping. The average total cost curve is a U-shaped. The marginal cost cross curve crosses the average total cost at the minimum of average total cost. Marginal average revenue can be shown by a horizontal line at the market price. So, to find the profit maximum level of output, we can follow the same rules as we discussed earlier. If the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, then the firm should increase the output. If the marginal cost is greater than the marginal return, then the firm should cease its output and look at reducing. At the profit maximization level of output, marginal return and marginal cost are exactly equal. Very similar to our equilibrium. I know in the book they explain these in formulas and abbreviations, and I do want you to be familiar with them, and I do want you to know that their concept and their use. But don't get too worried up or dug down too deep in the numbers or into the weeds of these issues. I really just want you to see how the formulas are used. So these rules apply not only to competitive firms, but also to firms with market power as well. If the price in the market were to change, the firm would set its new level of output by equaling the marginal revenue and marginal cost. Because the firm's marginal cost curve determines how much the firm is willing to supply at any price, it is the competitive firm's supply curve that's available. Okay, so how do firms make a short-run decision to shut down? In certain circumstances, a firm will decide to shut down and produce zero output, because zero output will actually generate more profit for the firm than it would be if they were producing more supply into the market, having to pay salaries, inputs, and other facilities that have to put into producing their units. And so sometimes this market will shut down, a firm will shut down in the short run. But there is a difference between temporary shutdown of a firm and an exit from the market. A shutdown refers to a short-term decision not to produce anything during a specific period of time because of the current market conditions. So too much supply. So we don't need more supply right now. Exit refers to a long-run decision where the firm decides to leave the market completely. There's also one more important difference. That is, when a firm shuts down temporarily, it must pay the fixed cost. If a firm exits the industry in the long run, there is no fixed cost. So if a firm shuts down, it will earn no revenue and will have only fixed costs, no variable costs. Therefore, a firm will shut down if the revenue that it would earn for producing less is more of the variable cost than it would be the production. So we can now tell exactly what the firm will do by maximizing its profits or minimizing its loss, which can actually yield a greater return. If the price is less than the average variable cost, the firm will produce no output. If the price is above the average variable cost, the firm will produce the level of output where the marginal revenue, our price, is equal to the marginal cost. Therefore, the competitive firm short-run supply curve is the portion of the marginal revenue that the curve lies above the average variable cost. So, now let's take into play sunken costs. When do we give up, or when do we say, hey, I've got what I can get out of this, I'm going to have to let it go? We worry so much about trying to get our value out of things that sometimes it even costs us more than if we would have let it go earlier. I'm sure everybody has had those situations. So let's talk more about sunken costs. Sunken costs is a cost that has been committed and cannot be recovered. Once a cost is sunk, it is no longer an opportunity cost because nothing can be done about the sunken cost. You should ignore them when you're making your decisions. If you look at your example in the book, and I believe on your PowerPoint, if you look at an empty restaurant offshore off of, say, a mini golf course, in making a decision where they open for lunch, a restaurant owner must weigh revenue with variable costs. Much of the cost of running a restaurant is somewhat fixed. The same criteria would be able to be applied to the decision whether a miniature golf course in the summer and a resort community should stay open during the other seasons. The course should only open if the revenue exceeds the variable cost. The firm's long-run decision to exit or enter the market can be used and make decisions through the curves. If a firm exits the market, it will earn no revenue, but it will have no cost as well. Therefore, the firm will exit if the revenue that it would have earned from producing more is less than the total cost. So you would exit the market if the total revenue is less than the total cost. A firm will enter an industry when there is profit potential. So it must mean that a firm will enter the revenue if the revenues will exceed the cost. Because in the long run, a firm will remain in the market only if the firm's long-run supply curve will be greater than its marginal cost and above the average total cost. So how does the supply curve work in a competitive market? In the short run, market supply is with a fixed number of firms.